Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. Today's episode, we're going to do our annual season review of our minor league system and some of our former players and some interesting prospects around mythical Major League Baseball here in 2040. And then subsequent to that, in our next episodes, we'll finally get on with the off-season. Before we get into that, though, just a personal note. Those of you who have watched over the years know that I'm a Yankees fan. Might be wondering what I think about the Evil Empire's recent acquisition yesterday of Juan Soto. And I'm pretty excited about it. Been pretty clear that I've been disappointed with the Yankees in the field, disappointed with the Yankees front office in terms of how they have approached the last several seasons, and certainly think that adding a 25-year-old who is one of the premier left-handed hitters, if not the premier left-handed hitter in all of baseball, is certainly a great asset for the team in this upcoming 2024 season. That said, it's quite possible that Soto ends up becoming a one-year rental for the Yankees. And when you look at the four pitchers and the catcher that were given up for Mr. Soto, it's a pretty steep price to pay for a one-year rental. Certainly the Yankees are always a win-now team, and the addition of Soto for a year makes it much more likely that they actually will win now in 2024. But with Scott Boras as his agent, certainly would expect Mr. Soto to be back on the free agent market a year from now looking for top dollar if things go well with the Yankees, and I expect that he would be a pretty good offensive force in the new Yankee Stadium. Hopefully they'll come up with the money to make it attractive for him to stick around. But very happy to have him on board. But I guess my opinion is it also could be a very expensive one-year rental in terms of King in particular and some of the other pitchers that they gave up, as well as Higgy. So we'll see how things go. But certainly I am happy they made the trade. Always nice to add a player in the prime of his career, and even though they'll be paying huge money for him in arbitration next year, rather than adding a player who's in his 30s and broken down, and you're also going to be paying tens of millions of dollars to, and in the case of some Yankees who we picked up in recent years, hundreds of millions of dollars to, for guys who are much older than Soto, much more injury prone and not as good on the field. So happy to have him on board, but think the price could prove to be rather expensive. So turning now our attention back to the Buffalo Wings and our minor league system. You can see we invested over $37 million in player development last year when all was said and done. And we had a couple of, or an earlier first-round pick than normal last season after a disappointing regular season, which we followed up with one of the great regular seasons in baseball history this past year with 118 wins. Unfortunately, we still were bounced in the first round of the playoffs, but adding some good talent into our system the last few years through the draft and international amateur free agency and investing heavily in player development have really turned the system around from being a pretty average minor league rated system over most of the past 5 years or so into one that right now ranks fourth overall in baseball. Top prospect in our system is Juan Toledo, international free agent signing from almost 2 years ago. Brought him to the minors, to the DSL this year as a 17-year-old, and he absolutely struggled as we thought he would. Hit a buck 42 with 113 strikeouts and 176 at-bats. Did hit 10 homers, so he's got the power that we thought he would. Long way to go until he's ready for the majors. Quite honestly, the way he played last year, he's probably got a couple years till he's even ready for A-ball. But we will keep coaching him up and hopefully be getting something from Mr. Toledo in the next 5 or 6 years at the major league level. Speaking of the major league level, Jim Lance, the number 7 prospect in baseball, second-round pick from 2036, split last year between Albany at AAA, and then we brought him up to the majors at the end of the year. He will likely be in our rotation next season. We've talked a lot in the last couple of episodes and in the comments to viewers that will likely be moving on from Juan Estrada or Sincere Shazier, who have been our 3 and 4 starters last year and have typically been our second, third, or fourth starters between the two of them over the last close to decade at this point. We'll likely be moving on from one of those pitchers, and we'll talk more about it at the end of this episode, most likely, to open up some money to potentially spend at a bat on the free agent market, and having a great young pitcher like Lance coming up who looks like we can plug him right into the rotation will make moving on from one of our very established and successful major league starters easier for us. Alejandro Contreras was the cornerstone of our biggest trade last offseason, split the year between AA Utica and AAA Albany, and then came up in September where he hit .412 and 34 at-bats. With the pending departures of our starting shortstop, Steve Anderson, the utility infielder Bentley, who we picked up near the trade deadline last year, and last year's third baseman Meza, we will have a huge role on the Major League club for Contreras next year. He could conceivably end up playing second or third or possibly even shortstop, but he will be a starter in the infield, and we'll be counting on him to provide a pretty decent bat for a likely middle infielder next year. So 3 top 16 prospects. Our only other top 100 prospect is Chris Lott, starting pitcher who we picked number 1 overall in the first round in 2037, 40th overall pick in a year that we had a supplemental pick. Number 69 prospect in baseball, was 12-5 with a 4.73 ERA and A-ball this year. Did strike out 212 batters in 150 innings. Probably will have him in AA next year, and would not be shocked if he is in AAA towards the end of next year. Luis Nava, another guy who's close to the major leagues, split the year between AA Utica and AAA Albany. Batting averages weren't great, .239 and .247. Did have 20 doubles, 2 triples, and 14 homers between those two levels. He's a guy we picked up in a trade with Colorado, the Bobby Bolig trade, almost 3 years ago. Kind of expected that he might be helping us at the major league level by this point. Don't know that he's going to have a huge role. You can see we've been training him at first base, but his infield ratings are not really good. But he is a natural outfielder with that 65 range, 75 error, and 50 arm. Likely has a future for us, is at the very least a 4th or a 5th outfielder. And if that contact continues to come along and he gets a little more home run power, he could be an everyday player for us. Wouldn't think next season. Would think he's certainly in the mix to be a September call-up next year. But with the depth we have at outfielder right now, would expect him to spend most of the upcoming season in AAA and then maybe help us consistently at the major league level in 2041. Andres Alfaro, scouting discovery from just 4 or 5 months ago. Third baseman. Incredible speed, pretty good base runner. he could definitely play third base with those ratings. At 6'4", he'd probably be an excellent defensive first baseman. And he's also a decent corner outfielder, so a lot of optionality with him defensively, potentially. Looks like his contact and his gap power could be off the charts. So should be able to slam a bunch of extra base hits around the field. Not a ton of home run power, and he's not going to generate a ton of walks. But as a 17-year-old who kind of came out of nowhere as a scouting discovery, happy to have Mr. Alfaro in our farm system, and the addition of a guy like him through that big investment that we have in scouting also helps move our farm system up to being number 4 overall. Number 4 overall would be a more appropriate way to say it. 3 final players who are in the top 200 prospects. Pat Carman, you may remember we went with him as our first round pick this year, 24th overall. Struggled in rookie ball, 1-2 with a 9.23 ERA, 28 walks and 42 strikeouts in 26 and a third innings. Turned 18 right when that season was ending. So he'll be 18 next year. Certainly will be back in the FCL. Ishmael Velasco is one of the depth pieces in the outfield that I was referencing shortly before. Spent most of last year in AAA Albany before coming up in September. Hit 275 and 51 at-bats in the majors. Nice glove, good personality, pretty good contact hitter. Not a ton of power, but think that bat could be pretty useful down the line. Also a switch hitter and durable. Decent on the base paths. A lot to like about Velasco, and he'll be fighting for a spot on the 26-man roster this upcoming year. And last but not least, in the 200 prospects, Jeff Frakowiak, and he's a guy who we picked first overall in 2039. He's had a couple of brutal seasons in rookie ball thus far, and this past season was very short, just 4 games, 0-1 record. Did strike out 18 and 11 innings, but he also walked 13 and gave up a couple of home runs before tearing his labrum at the end of June. Still recovering from that injury, should be ready for next year. Would hope that Frack, who will be turning 20 years old on April 2nd, will be more productive in rookie ball next year and perhaps even earn a promotion to A-ball when the rookie season is over in 2041. Couple other guys to highlight among some of our top prospects. Gregorio Garola, who we thought about taking over Frack, ended up dropping to us in the second round in that 2039 draft, so we ended up with both of them. 2-4 record with a 5.20 ERA, walking more than 1 batter per inning, similar to Frack, but certainly a better performance on the field. And you may remember that Garola is a potential two-way player. Hit 235 with 4 homers and 19 ribbies in 115 at-bats. The 19-year-old probably not quite ready for A-ball, but similar to Frakowiak, if things go better for him this coming year in A-ball and rookie ball, hopefully we'll be in A-ball by next August. A couple other guys to mention. Juan Palomo, international free agent signing from 2038. The infielder made his debut in rookie ball in the DSL this year. Hit a .192 in 151 at-bats. Think he could be someone who could help in the infield down the line for us. And another guy that we haven't really talked about much in previous episodes, but is part of the reason why we're willing to move on from Estrada and or Shazier, is Luis Palencia, a 24-year-old pitcher who was an international free agent signing for us in 2035. Taken him a while to develop, but he finally really has. A season ago, he was in high A ball and put up a 4.10 ERA. We promoted him to Double A anyways this year, and he went 10-2 with a 2.57 ERA, and then 6-3 at the end of the year in Triple A Albany with a 3.25 ERA. Well over a strikeout per inning at both levels, and combined for a 6.5 WAR between the two levels. Great personality, and you look at his profile here. Stuff, movement, and control all looking major league average or better. And potentially a 4-pitch arsenal. Doesn't have the greatest stamina in the world. He's probably only a 5-inning guy. But Palencia is another guy who could get caught in a numbers game this year, even if we do move on from an Estrada or a Shazier, but certainly has a hopefully big role in our pitching staff in the not so distant future. And moving on from the prospects in our own system to some of the prospects we've looked at acquiring in previous years. A few to check in on: Jorge Rente, who was an international free agent signing in 2036. Pitching prospect we really liked. Number 70 prospect in baseball. Finally got promoted to A-ball this past year. 5-6 with a 4.31 ERA. Still has some control issues with 77 walks, but the 162 strikeouts and 125 in a third innings, pretty impressive number. You look at his pitching ratings, and if he's able to harness that control, certainly looks like someone who could be a useful major league pitcher. Not a top of the rotation guy, but could be a pretty solid number 3 starter. He looks like if he fully develops, may end up a little better than that or a little worse than that, but still a pretty useful player. Ernesto Zambrana still looks at 19 years old as if he could be an absolutely incredible pitcher. Still wondering if that changeup will develop to give him a 4th pitch in his arsenal, but we think his fastball, sinker, and splitter are all pretty close to major league quality. Spent a 3rd consecutive year in rookie ball this year, but he did just turn 19 years old, so he's someone that the Reds got into their minor league system real early. 2-1 record with a 2.44 ERA over 51 2/3 innings. Would have to think that the number 26 prospect in baseball will be in A-ball next year. And a 3rd pitcher, Luis Zapata, guy who was picked 36th overall this year. Looks like a potentially excellent reliever. He's still listed as a starting pitcher. Did start only 1 game in rookie ball for Detroit this year. Allowed 1 run over 5 innings, 7 strikeouts, 2 walks. Still think he could be a pretty useful major league reliever, the left-hander when all is said and done, and he's also a potential 2-way player. Only 4 games in rookie ball this year, so my hunch is Detroit didn't sign him until early August or late July. Hit 250 with 1 home run in 12 at-bats. And last but not least among the pitchers is Frank Ramos, another guy we thought about taking in this year's draft. Went 56th overall in the 2nd round. He is definitely going to be a reliever coming out of Ball State. Pitched in rookie ball, high A ball, and double A ball this year, and was pretty successful in limited sample sizes at all 3 of those levels. 20 combined minor league innings, and he struck out 35 batters across those 3 levels. An absolutely incredible cutter. Helps his stuff be off the charts. Great movement. Just going to need to harness that control. That was one of my concerns with him. He is almost 23 years old, and his control is still pretty suspect. Not the end of the world necessarily for a reliever, but also, don't want to be in a situation where in a big playoff game in the late innings you bring in a Ramos and he ends up issuing a few ill-timed walks. So hopefully he will develop that control a bit better over the next year or two, and would not be shocked to see him in the major leagues, possibly even next year. And Guadalupe Amezcua, who was one of the cornerstones of our trade for Contreras. And he was, I believe, around the 40th ranked prospect in baseball when we traded him away a year ago. And looking at what our scout thinks of his potential profile right now, we may have gotten some pretty good value for him when we traded him away, as I said, largely for Contreras. But he was a big piece of the offer for Contreras. But there were many other good pieces in there. It will be a year ago tomorrow that we traded him away. Spent a third year in A-ball this year. Got the batting average up to 258 and did hit 21 home runs. So pretty productive for a guy in A-ball. But Mezcua is also now 24 years old, and he's never played above A-ball. So again, like his glove, like some of his personality traits, the bat just hasn't really developed as we had hoped it might 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So think the fact that we were able to use him as a cornerstone for the trade for Contreras worked out for us, thanks to those of you who have suggested moving on from him over the years. I believe Three Quarters Badger is one of the ones who had really talked with us in the comment section about moving on from Amezcua. And Three Quarters Badger is also someone we haven't heard from in the comment section that recently. So hopefully the Badger is doing well, and hopefully he'll engage again with the channel down the line. And one of the most interesting things sometimes makes us feel good, and sometimes it's pretty painful, that we do every year is check in on some of our former players. Some of them we traded away. Some of them we voluntarily parted ways with through free agency. And some of them we let leave even though we knew we would likely miss them because of, most often, financial considerations, but there's a pretty impressive list of guys who have spent time with our organization that are now playing for other teams in the majors. Jorge Carrillo, a pitcher who came up through our farm system. Given that we've invested so much in pitching over the years, we let him go when he started making big money. He has been a solid, respectable major league starter over most of the course of his career, and has kind of continued to do that in Montreal, but he's making a lot more money to kind of be a solid, respectable starter than he made when he was on the major league minimum and his low arbitration years with us. So think that moving on from him was the right decision. Isidro Ochoa, another guy who was an important part of our rotation for many years, traded him to Atlanta just about 2 years ago at this point. He was one of the cornerstones of the trade that brought us Juan Romero, who's been our top hitter the last couple of years in terms of homers and ribbies. Ochoa, kind of similar to Carrillo, been a good solid pitcher over the course of his career. 3-13 record this year, did have 11 saves as he was used as the closer for the Braves at one point. 31 years old, though. Another guy who felt was replaceable with the depth of starting pitching we've built in our system, and think that's probably been proven accurate. Ali Ostendorf, a guy that we picked second overall. Brutal year in terms of the one-loss record for Atlanta this year, 2-17. And amazingly, those 17 losses didn't lead the National League in losses. Yeah, I was going to say Ostendorf had 17 losses, which did lead the league several years ago. But a 2-17 year. Seems like the Braves probably had a pretty rough offense this year because he wasn't horrible. 4.37 ERA, 4.07 Sierra, the ERA plus and FIP minus both in the average-ish type of range, and he still put up a 3.1 WAR, but incredibly unlucky, it looks like, in terms of the one-loss record this year. Drake Purvis, St. Louis, good solid starter. Moved on from Miami, where we had traded him years ago. He was the cornerstone of the deal that brought us our ace, Alexis Barajas, back. Purvis 11-8 with a league best 5.2 strikeout to walk ratio this year in his first year in St. Louis. And the final pitcher to talk about is Lorne Walborn, a guy who we controversially moved on from a couple years ago when he was looking for more than we were willing to pay him. We ended up swapping in as our stopper for him Nate Ruckel, another left-handed high-volume pitcher who's done a really good job filling that stopper role that we've had. And not even 35 years old. Looking at the ratings, it looks like Walborn's career could just about be over. He was 2-2 with a 6.23 ERA for Texas this year. Also spent almost as much time, maybe even more time, down at AA Frisco. And Walborn barely throwing 90 miles an hour at this point. Looks like it was a fortunate move for us to move on from Walborn when he was looking for a little more money than we were willing to pay him a few years ago. One guy who moved on and has had more success with the Dodgers than Walborn did is Andres Medina. We waived him last December to clear some money and open up a spot for our young catcher, Mr. Barrios. And all Medina did with the Dodgers was make his third All-Star team this year. That said, it was a pretty typical Andres Medina season. 206 average, did have 14 homers and 383 at-bats, but he also struck out 136 times. Remains an excellent defensive catcher with some great personality traits. But for the $18 million he was going to make this year, we kind of really wanted to get out of that contract. And it looks like he could be headed to free agency this year, where since we don't have any real need at catcher with the two guys that replaced him on our roster, probably will not be interested in pursuing him. Arturo Flores is a right-handed hitting first baseman. We moved on from 3 years ago at this point, and he's actually had pretty good success away from us. We struggled to find him at bats. We're basically playing him primarily against left-handed pitching. Had the worst year of his 3-year stint with the Angels this year. The batting average was just .220. Did still hit 19 homers. He's had over 600 at-bats 3 straight seasons. With the 98 and the 123 WRC plus, he had those first couple years with the Angels. We were second-guessing, perhaps, that we didn't get enough for him in return and trade. But this year, an 81 WRC plus, over 600 at-bats at a premium offensive position like first base, ended up resulting in a negative WAR of 1 win for him over the course of the season. So I still think he's a guy who would be a lot more successful just playing against left-handed pitching, but clearly that's not the way the Angels have decided to use him. Cam Collier looks like he could be nearing the end of the road. He's going to turn 36 years old in a couple of weeks. Hit just .210 with 8 homers for Atlanta. Looks like he was still their everyday third baseman this year, but that 71 WRC plus is likely the lowest number he's put up in his career. Joe Edwards, third baseman who came up through our farm system, moved on from him when he was going to start making some serious money. Signed with San Diego a year ago. Actually, I think we traded him away, didn't we? Or no, he was a free agent, so we decided to we made him a QO, which he didn't accept, and then afterwards I was hemming and hawing back and forth about potentially bringing him back, which some of you chastised me for. Looks like he combined for 26 homers and 84 ribbies between the Padres and the Red Sox. but hit 207 and 201 for both of those teams. So still definitely struggling to make consistent contact. Still also strikes out a lot, although he is pretty good at drawing walks, pretty versatile in where he can play defensively. But for the money he's making, probably was the right decision to move on from him. Bobby Bolig, you may remember, is a guy we moved on for salary reasons a couple years ago. He's had a couple of solid seasons in Colorado in the 3 years since we moved on from him. Led the league in runs each of the last 2 years and had by far his best season this past year. Put up a 150 WRC plus, 322 average, 28 homers, 7 triples, 44 doubles, 26 steals. At times, he was an excellent offensive player for us. He'd really kind of started dipping in terms of his performance his last couple years with us. After a 140 WRC plus in 2035, dipped to 122 and then 117 before we moved on from him. But certainly playing in Colorado seems to have rejuvenated his career a bit. Jorge Climaco, been a utility outfielder with us, or that's what we envisioned him being, a guy who had been really successful hitting in AAA Albany for us. We never gave him a real fair chance, and he was an important player in the trade that we made last year, along with a Mezcua that ended up bringing us Alejandro Contreras. So still think that we got the best player overall in that deal with Contreras, but we probably underestimated how good Climaco's bat can be. Once again, hit over 300 in AAA with a 340 average, and he also got 300 at-bats in the majors, 20 doubles, 10 homers, 10 steals, and a 317 batting average. Not the best eye in the world, so his on-base percentage was only 349, but still put up a 134 WRC plus. We've got a lot of good young outfielders, as I've talked about, but you certainly could argue that Climaco may end up being as good as any of them. Tim Gaglia, center fielder who we moved on from a couple years ago at this point, played every day for Atlanta this year, 232 average, 11 homers, 75 WRC plus. Good speed. He was 24 out of 24 on the base paths for the Braves. Good defensive outfielder with that great range. The issue with him has always been whether or not he can hit enough to stay in the lineup. Tyreek Hardage has historically had a similar pattern, although he had probably the best full season of his career this past year with the Angels. Hit 253 with 33 doubles, 7 triples, 9 homers, put up a 105 WRC plus and a 4.1 WAR as a 30-year-old for the Angels. Another guy with some speed, decent defensive ability, in a bat that, similar to Gaglia, has oftentimes been pretty close to major league average. Joe Gallagher, a guy who we moved on from a little less than a year ago. He finally got through those minimum pay years, and given his personality, defensive, and speed-related limitations, we decided we had seen enough of him after he hit a $179 for us while striking out 177 times a year ago. He did have, admittedly, a bounce-back year in Nashville this year. Got the batting average up almost 50 points to 228, 34 homers, 76 ribbies, and 479 at-bats. All added up to a 111 WRC plus. But given the defensive and speed limitations he has, only a 0.3 WAR on the year for him. So that was improvement from a year ago when he was a win below replacement level. But the issue with him is that despite the fact he can hit the ball out of the ballpark, the whole package is just not all that compelling. So we were happy to let him move on to the Nashville Stars. Last but not least is a guy that I'm glad to see having some better seasons recently. Shamar Jenneret was a member of both of our world champion teams in 2034 and 2036, was the World Series MVP each of those years, won the regular season MVP for us in 2035. And his first couple years in Boston were marred by ineffectiveness and injuries. But he really bounced back with a vintage Shamar Jenneret season a year ago when he led the league with a 161 WRC plus. Wouldn't say that this 2040 year at the age of 35 was a vintage season for him, but still hit 284 with 32 doubles, 83 ribbies, put up a 136 WRC plus. So he seems to be a guy who in his mid-30s is likely to continue to trend downwards. He's also fragile in terms of his injury proneness. Still making a lot of money, $31.5 million next year, followed by $26 million in the last year of his contract. So that was a contract we were realistically not going to be able to offer him, especially with our intent to keep Deshaun Seifu a wing for life. But no hard feelings over Mr. Seifu. Always happy to have him having some success on the field. In his mid-30s now, 39.3 career WAR, does have 408 homers and 1,253 ribbies, won MVP awards in both leagues, led the league in ribbies 4 consecutive years, including all 3 of his years with us. Probably needs to have another 3 pretty good seasons to kind of put himself into Hall of Fame contention. The career WAR for him, because of his defensive limitations, is not going to be very impressive when all is said and done, but he still conceivably could get to 500 homers and 1,500 ribbies. And if he gets to both of those marks, being a 2-time MVP, at least a 2-time World Series champion, tons of All-Star awards, tons of Silver Sluggers, would have to think that he will be in the mix to eventually be enshrined in Cooperstown. So as we get ready to finish up the episode, I'm going to probably at least talk about and possibly make a big transaction here. We've talked in previous episodes after our disappointing exit from the playoffs that with the depth we have in our starting pitching and our pitching staff in general, improving the offense is a critical goal for this offseason, particularly with the fact that we'll also be moving on from Anderson, Meza, and Bentley, as I mentioned. And we talked through in our last episode that among the upcoming free agents, Daniel Rojas, the first baseman, is a guy who stands out to us as the type of bat we could really use in the middle of our lineup. Good home run power, also really good at drawing walks, makes pretty good contact, decent defensive first baseman who actually won a Gold Glove back in 2033. Iron Man in terms of his injury proneness. I don't think he's quite a Shamar Jenneret in terms of his offensive production. He is coming off one of the best seasons in his career. Going to be turning 35 next season, and he's going to likely be looking for over $30 million a year. So I'd love to have his bat in our lineup. I don't want to make a 5 or 6 year commitment. In a perfect world, it would be a 3-year commitment with a team option or 2. Realistically, might need to go to a 4-year commitment to have any chance at getting him. But I think he's the type of bat that we could certainly use to lengthen and strengthen our batting order. So if he does end up hitting free agency, he is kind of our prime target. With the money he's going to be looking for, we need to free up probably $20+ million from the budget since our other goal is to bring on another infielder, since the three everyday players we'll be losing this offseason most likely are all infielders. And because of that, Juan Estrada, who's set to make $26 million next year if we exercise his team option, has to me been a more attractive guy to potentially move on from than Sincere Shazier, who's 3 years younger and making $12 million a year less, although he is not a two-way player like Estrada. Unfortunately, and part of the reason we're likely moving on from Estrada, is that he's looking for 6 years at almost $33 million a year in terms of an extension. So he's looking for some incredible money. I feel like we've gotten really good value out of him as a two-way guy over the years, but as a guy who's going to be 34 by the beginning of next year, coming off one of his worst pitching and hitting seasons for us. We'll miss his bat in the lineup, career .293 hitter with a .389 on base percentage if we do end up moving on from him. But I think he's at the age and at the salary level where it's going to be pretty hard for him to generate a positive return for us. And we've got the pitchers to slot in for him in the rotation. We've got a lot of good young outfield bats, as I outlined in our previous episode. We'll lose the flexibility of having one body who can help us both on the mound and in the field and at the plate. But I think he's ultimately a fairly replaceable player in terms of what he brings at this point in his career to the mound, particularly, and also to the plate, even though, as I said, his skill set is unique for us with a lot of guys who don't walk that much and strike out a lot. But with the money that Estrada's making and with the money that it looks like he expects to make next year, unfortunately, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, the trade market for him isn't incredible. You know, most of what we can pick up for him are guys like these guys from the Diamondbacks, Jared Landis, borderline starting pitcher, if that slider develops. Otherwise, interesting relief arm. Bob Starkey, decent relief arm. Dave Shelby, another decent relief arm. But a decent reliever for a guy like Estrada isn't an incredibly high return, quite honestly. And I think that kind of documents a bit that with the $26 million he's set to make next year, he's becoming pretty fully valued. So I have thought about, and this is another thing that those of you who follow me and interact with me in the comments know, have thought about, do we just trade him? Do we decline the option and just move on? Do we accept the option and bring him back? Or do we decline the option and make him a qualifying offer, assuming that the money, with the amount of money he's looking for, that he certainly would not accept a qualifying offer for about $19 million a year. So there's a lot of different permutations that we've thought about with Mr. Estrada. And before kind of resolving that issue, what I wanted to investigate and what I have investigated offline is if we're able to bring on the big first baseman in free agency, are there any options for us in the upcoming free agent market who could fill our other roles in the middle of our infield? And I don't know that there really are, because Steve Anderson and Derek Bentley are two guys who are in our middle infield right now who are going to be looking for about $20 million a year and $16 million a year that we're not necessarily willing to bring back. And a similar thing with Meza, who's going to be looking for over $20 million a year. Those three guys are three of the more attractive infielders out there. Our old buddy Tim Hull, who was a utility infielder for us many years, is also out there. But in terms of the money these guys would be making and what they bring to the table, I'm not inclined to hit the free agent market hard for the offensive player that we need next year. I think if I go in it, I'm hoping that Rojas is going to be available and we go big for Rojas and spend most of our money there. So that has led me to kind of peruse teams' rosters as to whether there are any options in the trade market to potentially bring on another infielder for us who can share some time at a second base, third base, or shortstop position with a Seifu and or a Contreras next year and help ensure that we can use Teagan Tiley as more of a utility player rather than a guy who would need to start for us. So we kind of searched for potential infielders who could help us, and quite honestly, the search was not all that ambitious. We were just looking for someone who was at a minimum average defensively with average contact power and eye and could play second base. And you can see there's only about a dozen or so players who fit that profile. And the tough thing for us is with Anderson, Bentley, we've got two of those guys on our team this year that aren't going to be with us next year. Now, real happy that we have Contreras on board, but we've got to fill those holes, and we don't want to fill the Anderson hole at $20 million or the Bentley hole at about $16 million. So there were some real interesting young players, Kadeem Aubert, Kevin Stiles, Oberth Bruflat, a lot of guys that were real interesting, but the prices on those guys were incredibly expensive. Max Ziegler is a guy who is an incredible second baseman, but set to make an incredible amount of money going forward. Eric Barger and Doug Nugent, also guys that were relatively expensive. We looked at Mike Kinney with the Brewers, and this is a guy who's been signed to an extension for the next 3 years. Reasonably balanced bat and a reasonably balanced glove. Not an incredible player, and with the amount of money he's going to be making, was borderline the amount of interest that we would have in him. Steve Moriarty with the Mets is another guy we looked at. We didn't like him as much, didn't like his bat as much, didn't like his glove as much. So we kind of honed in on Mike Kinney, is a guy who, although he's making $8 to $9 million for the next 3 years, that's still a lot less money than we would have been paying to bring back Anderson or Bentley, and felt like Kinney was a guy who could play multiple infield positions for us. And you look at him over the course of his career, he's put up a 110 WRC plus. So he was a guy that I really explored trading for. And unfortunately, the amount that they were looking for him was, to me, out of whack. I really wanted to bring him on board, but we had to be putting 5-6 players in a deal to get him straight up, including Estrada, who I am willing to move on from. But we also had to include the excellent reliever Jimenez. We had to give up one of our better young outfielders, and we had to give up some other prospects as well. So for a guy who is certainly above a replacement level player, I mean, he's coming off of a 5.2 WAR season, so he's a good, solid major leaguer. We were kind of willing to pay him $8 or $9 million a year, but with the fact that we had to give up so much to bring him on board, and he's going to be 30 years old in less than 2 weeks. I ultimately moved on from Kinney as one of the guys that we were pursuing, and I kind of lowered my standards as to who the next target might be for an infielder. So we lowered our standards a bit. We actually tightened up our standard a bit, looking for someone who we think is at least a little bit above average defensively. But we lowered our hitting standards so this person could certainly be a below average offensive player. And you'll see that means we've got 4 on our team right now with Teagan Tiley, who we want to be a bench player, listed. Several of the same names that we talked about were still out there on this list, along with some new players, as well as Kenny, who we spent some time talking about, also on the list. But the guy that we ended up honing in on is a younger guy who meets these criteria, Jim Andrews, a second baseman for the Red Sox. And he split this past year between AAA Worcester and the Major League Club. 258 hitter in Worcester, hit just 238 in 214 at-bats for Boston. Doesn't have a lot of speed, but he's got a pretty interesting glove with that 65 range and the 65 arm. Certainly not ideal anywhere in the infield. You can see he's been trained at first, second, and short. With those ratings, third base is the position I think he could quite honestly really potentially excel at. But he's 25 years old and his adaptability isn't the best in the world. Could certainly coach him up to play there. At second base, except for the turn double play rating, we'd be pretty comfortable with him there. And he could play shortstop. Not an ideal shortstop, but we like the fact that there's pretty good range there, a pretty nice arm, and a fair amount of defensive versatility within the infield. Also a guy who could play a corner outfield spot if we needed. But the other thing that I liked about Andrews is that, at least according to our scout, he still could get his contact up a considerable amount from where it is. Now, granted, he's going to be turning 26 years old at the beginning of next year. So he's certainly at the age where development should slow dramatically and pretty close to coming to an end. But he is a guy who I think could be better offensive player than the 77 WRC plus that he put up in his first taste in the majors this year. I don't expect that he's going to completely round out another 15 points in contact, another 5 points in gap power, and another 20 points in avoid strikeouts. But he does have good work ethic, good intelligence, high loyalty, and he's a pretty interesting defensive player. And he's also a younger guy who's going to be on the major league minimum for the next 2 to 3 seasons. So he's a guy that I've honed in on as a more cost-effective replacement who could end up playing a pretty prominent role for us next year. And the interesting thing is that when I've tried to trade for him, Mr. Juan Estrada himself will not get the deal done, but he's pretty close to getting the deal done. So although Andrews wasn't listed as one of the players that Boston would offer straight up for Juan Estrada, I think we can pick him up in a trade including Estrada. But unlike that trade that we were talking about for the veteran who's got a better bat but not quite as good of a glove, we're not going to have to giving up a ton of other resources to bring Jim Andrews on board. And given the fact that he's also making the major league minimum, that potentially puts us in a situation where if Rojas, the first baseman, does hit the free agent market and we don't want to make a extremely long-term commitment to him, we could front load that contract a bit, even if it's only a 3 or 4 year deal, and potentially make it financially compelling for him to consider maybe not looking for 5 or 6 years. And Juan Estrada has definitely been an important player for us. As I mentioned, he's a two-way guy, been an excellent, well, not an excellent, but a very good pitcher for us over the course of his career. A 111-63 record, won 15 games for us once and 16 games for us once. Led the league with a 2.69 ERA back in 2035, was a member of both of our World Championship teams. And earlier in his career, he was a very good playoff player, winning 3 playoff series MVP awards. Overall, 111-63 with a 3.53 ERA, almost a 26 WAR as a pitcher over his decade in the majors, 9 years of which were in Buffalo after we made that trade for him with Pittsburgh when he was coming off of his rookie year. So he's been a really good pitcher, and he's been a pretty good hitter for us as well. As I mentioned, close to a 300 hitter, close to a 400 on-base percentage, 122 WRC plus over the course of his career, and a 15 WAR. Largely has been a number 2 hitter for us, given that he does only have 2 career home runs, 3 career home runs. Kind of weird. Why is that not adding up properly for his major league career? Oh, that wasn't his major league career. Okay, I've corrected that now. Two home runs over the course of his career. So not a ton of pop in his bat, and he was also a very inefficient base runner despite having decent speed, and it seemed like not horrible base running instincts. But as a guy who's set to make $26 million, who's in his mid-30s, and who, as we talked about, is looking for 6 years and $30 million as a potential extension, he's not in our long-term or, quite honestly, even in our medium-term plans at this point. And with the departures that we have in the infield of some more experienced and more expensive players, bringing on a cheap guy like Andrews, who's got a pretty interesting glove, can play a lot of different positions, some positive personality traits, and again, a bat that I think could be a average-ish major league type bat, particularly if that contact continues to develop and he cuts his strikeouts a bit, both of which are possible. We're certainly giving up the best player in the deal in Juan Estrada, and we also have to add in Alexis Mazuka. We do get about $800,000 back in return if we make this trade. Our assistant GM doesn't like it, but I've generally found that the assistant GM advice on trades can be less than reliable and well thought out. You may remember Alexis Mazuka. He was a guy we picked in the 5th round back in 2035 who was looking for just crazy money. So we picked him up. It was a year that we had some extra money. He was better than a 5th round prospect at the time in terms of what he thought his potential was. But he dropped because he was looking for crazy money that we were able to pay him. Suffered a concussion back in July, still recovering from post-concussion syndrome. He did hit 281 in 288 bats in Double-A this year, but he's 24 years old at this point, and looking at his profile, he's a 4th or a 5th outfielder in a best-case scenario. Does still have good outfield range, does still have a little bit of speed. He is durable. But with the depth we have in young outfielders who are kind of his age or younger in most cases, who are kind of already at the AAA or borderline major league level, not a huge asset to us at this point. So we are going to say goodbye to Mr. Estrada. As I talked about, I feel like we can replace him as a pitcher very easily. We've got tons of good young outfielders who can largely replace what he's done for us offensively. can probably find some outfielders, can certainly find some outfielders who are better than him in the field. So the only thing that's difficult to replace is the fact that he could do all those things in one roster spot on the 26-man roster rather than two roster spots. But at $26 million this year and zero willingness on our parts to potentially be paying him over $30 million a year in his mid to late 30s, we didn't love the relievers that were offered for us for him. We give up a guy who's probably the 12th or 13th best outfield prospect in our organization, who's 24 years old, coming off of a major injury. And we get a second baseman who at the very least gives us a good defensive infielder to mix in for the next few years when he's not making a lot of money. And potentially has a bat that he could be a starting player for us. I think I like him better than Teagan Tiley already. So at the very least, Andrus lets us put Tiley to the bench. And with the money that we will open up from moving on from Mr. Estrada, that will set us up so that going after the expensive first baseman, Mr. Rojas, to really bolster our lineup is the big goal of free agency this year. Now, there is a risk that Rojas re-signs before hitting free agency, in which case we're opening up a lot of money and don't know exactly where we would go with it. But there are options there. Colton Sims is a guy we've looked at for many years, a good veteran bat. Michael Harris can still hit. Anderson, Bentley, Jimmy Burns, Dylan Cruz is a guy we've tried to trade for in the past. Talked about Daniel Meza. Brad Sanders is a guy we've looked at. Dave Scott, even as an infielder. Decent glove, decent bat. He's almost 32 years old, looking for $8 million. So there's certainly options we could use to build out the team if Rojas doesn't hit free agency, or if he ends up wanting something ridiculous like 7 years at $33 million a year and he won't come off of that. But I think my hope is that by moving on from Mr. Estrada and picking up Mr. Andrus, we're still really happy with our pitching staff, with the youngsters that are coming up. We like our catchers, we like our outfielders, and adding the big first baseman in the middle of our lineup hopefully will be an important step in turning this team that's been dominant into the regular season back into a team that can be more successful in the postseason. So we're going to say goodbye to Mr. Estrada. I'm sure the fans are not pleased about it. Definitely a guy, as I mentioned, who's been with us 9 years, been in the playoffs every single one of those 9 years with us, won a couple championships with us. The fans not happy to have Mr. Estrada gone. But we still have 100 fan interest. And as you can see, we've now got about $30 million available to be spending in this upcoming offseason, which with hopefully some degree of additional savings as we sign our arbitration-eligible players over the next couple weeks and perhaps even move on from a couple of them or trade them away, will put us in a position where we can be competitive players for Mr. Rojas when free agency begins in a few weeks. And we will find out what happens in salary arbitration and what happens in the lead up to free agency in our next episode. Would love to know what you think about the Estrada trade. As I said, I don't generally love trades when I give up the best player, and I think we certainly did that in this trade. But we also took a lot of money off the books. We got younger, and with Andrus now on board in our infield, that does make the potential losses of Steve Anderson, Daniel Meza, and Derek Bentley a lot more palatable for our prospective 26-man roster in 2041. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.